Hi everybody, and welcome to today's Convocation. My name is David Lisker. I am the violin professor at Western Michigan, and I hope that you're all having a great first month back to school. I know the circumstances are very odd and there's a lot to get used to, but I hope that you're all thriving and in good spirits. Today's Convocation is sort of an introduction to the recital that I'll be presenting tonight as part of the Dalton Live and Interactive Concert Series. And I'll be joined by a very good friend of mine and pianist Larry Weng. I'm actually currently kind of bunkered down in Southern California at my family house. And Larry is currently at his apartment in New York City. So it was definitely an experience to try to put this recital together, as well as this presentation for the Convocation. The theme of tonight's concert is a sort of celebration of Beethoven, because it is his 250th anniversary. Larry will present you with an introduction and a sort of beautiful lecture about his two solo sonatas that he'll be performing, starting with the Moonlight Sonata and then followed by an Opus 109 sonata. And so it features incredible music, some of his most celebrated pieces, including the Spring Sonata, which Larry and I did our best to record together, sort of superimposing. So I'm going to hand it off to Larry, who will give you an incredible insight into the two solo piano sonatas that he'll be performing. And then at the end, I will speak about the Spring Sonata, and even more so than the sonata itself, but really the experience of what it was like to create chamber music without the musician, your fellow partner, in the room with you, and considering how important the dialogue between instruments was to Beethoven, this was definitely an interesting experience. So I hope that you enjoy this presentation, and so take it away, Larry.
In honor of Beethoven's 250th anniversary, David and I have chosen to present a program of 3 Beethoven sonatas, 1 piano and violin, and 2 solo sonatas for piano. Now, luckily for us, Beethoven wrote sonatas consistently through the span of his compositional career, meaning that they provide an incredibly detailed and comprehensive examination of how his compositional technique changed through his career, from the very beginning, middle, and then late phases of his life. Now, the first sonata on the program for tonight will be the famous Opus 27 number 2 piano sonata, also known as the Moonlight Sonata. Now, a little biographical data about this piece. The official title that Beethoven wrote on the piece is Sonata Quasi una Fantasia, which is roughly translated a sonata kind of fantasy. So he is saying that the piece plays a little bit fast and loose with the conventions of our standard sonata form, which is something that I'll talk about later on as well with the other solo piano sonata that follows. Now, the famous Moonlight Sonata, this Opus 27 number 2, was written in the year 1801, and it is around this point where most scholars and musicians would delineate the end of Beethoven's early phase and the beginning of his middle phase. And I think the easiest way and the most clear point of delineation is the composition of the Third Symphony, the Eroica Symphony, which was such a marked departure from anything else that came before. It was larger, it was more daring, it marshaled more resources as a piece, and that was begun in its compositional process in 1802, ranging to its completion in 1804. So this sonata was written right before that period. Now, the sonata is in 3 movements. The first movement, perhaps most famous, is slow, adagio sostenuto, and with the pedal used consistently through the entire movement. This is a marking that Beethoven took pains to write himself. Now, on the broadwood or any kind of equivalent instrument that Beethoven would have had in his time, this technique would have created this beautiful, hazy, nocturnal effect. Now, on the modern Steinway, let me demonstrate. If we put the pedal down for more than one bar, we get this. Which is still okay. Now, when we get a real different harmony, it starts to get a little muddy, and then here, with the increased harmonic rhythm, we get sludge. So one of the difficulties and challenges to the performer for this sonata is to figure out a way to accomplish the goals that Beethoven wanted, or the effect that Beethoven wanted in writing that indication, without obviously just putting the pedal down, slamming the pedal down for the entire movement. The movement is perhaps the part that is most fantasy. This movement is the most fantasy-like of the three movements of the piece. But if we look at it more closely, it is still, roughly speaking, in a sonata allegro form, meaning it harbors most of the features that a sonata allegro form requires, which are what? It needs a primary key, a secondary key area. It needs a developmental section where we leave those two keys, and then we come back to the global tonic, and then where in the recapitulation we would have, in the exposition we would have gone to the secondary key area, in the recapitulation we stay in the tonic. And in fact, we have all those features here. I'm going to briefly just go over them. So we have our first key area at the very beginning, C sharp minor. As we go on, we get the transition into the second key area of E major, the relative major of C sharp minor, which is, for a minor mode sonata, the expected key relationship for our secondary key area. However, the surprising thing is that he doesn't stay there long. And if you want to hear how he develops it, tune into the concert. So he leaves the key and does some stuff that is a little bit unexpected. And then we have a development, or a quasi-development. It's very small. But the thing that really gives it away is that we have a bunch of measures where we sit on G sharp in the bass. Now, what is G sharp? G sharp is the global dominant, meaning we need this. If we hear it long enough, it wants to go there. Right? So we have a lot of this. So forth, and he keeps it up, building that tension until we finally return to home. And then we get that, even that first theme again. Now, this piece and this theme reminds me of a apocryphal joke that Leonard Bernstein used to make about what made Beethoven great. And he would ask, and it was not about this piece, but it applies quite well to this piece as well. It was about actually the slow movement of the Seventh Symphony. And he would ask, what makes this movement great? Is it the harmony? it's just 1-5-1. Is it the rhythm? No, nothing special there either. It's just this rhythm, essentially, for the entire movement. Is it the melody? There's barely a melody. So what is it about that makes this music great? Well, that's one of the mysteries and great beauties of Beethoven's music, is that it is more than the sum of its parts. And the same can really be said about this first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. When you break it down into its components, you just have a very simple bass line. You have an ostinato triplet. And on top of that, you have a, nominally you could call it a melody. It's almost a funeral dirge. It goes almost nowhere. So it's how he incorporates and uses all these little elements, and we'll see that that's true, especially as he matures. And when we talk about the next sonata on the program, you'll see how that happens, that he takes even the smallest units of music and spins out an entire tapestry out of it. Now, I want to end this talk about this first movement with a little bit of interesting biographical data, because it does, it doesn't always inform how we're supposed to read the music, but it does give us an inkling into the psychological, emotional state of the composer while he was writing it. And for this piece especially, that seems to be important in its genesis, at least. We can infer that from whom he dedicated this piece to, which was a certain Countess Giulietta Guicciardi, who was, like many of the dedicatees for his piano sonatas, one of his students. And not only one of his students, but one of the students that he fell in love with. And this was a trend that would continue through Beethoven's career. He would have these infatuations with his students, his piano students. And we know this because he wrote amply about the subject. In a letter that he wrote in November of 1801, he wrote to a friend, "My life is once more a little more pleasant. I'm out and about again, among people. You can hardly believe how desolate, how sad my life has been these last 2 years. This change was caused by a sweet, enchanting girl who loves me, and whom I love. After 2 years, I'm again enjoying some moments of bliss. And it is the first time that I feel that marriage could make me happy. But unfortunately, she is not of my station, and now I certainly could not marry now." And again, this sentiment of not being able to marry and falling in love with women, quote unquote, above his station would continue and frustrate him throughout his life. And so the impetus for writing this piece, it's not certain that this was some sort of a love letter. It'd be kind of a strange, almost morbid love letter to Giulietta. But this ruminatory quality of the piece and some of that agitation and also joy can be seen in all of the movements. And some of that joy and some of that innocence we can see in the second movement, which is what we would typically see in a minuet trio, which in a 4-movement sonata form, where you would typically see the minuet trio, would be the third movement. And here's the second movement. This movement is such a diametric shift from the first movement that Liszt famously called it a flower between two chasms. So it comes from one dark place and goes to another dark place. But this movement, divided into the minuet and trio, the minuet itself is very bucolic, very pastoral. With these quite simple, quite standard 4-bar phrases. But what he does is that he introduces a wrinkle into the texture. He introduces a little germ of an idea, which then comes to fruition in the trio. So the second repetition of this antecedent consequent phrase we have this. This syncopation over the bar lines. Now, it appears a bit through the rest of this very short minuet, but where it really rears its head is in the trio, where you get this. And the entire trio is this playing around with that little bit of a German idea that he set up at the beginning of the minuet, and it comes to fruition here in the trio. Now, the minuet trio is very short. In fact, the first two movements combined are shorter than the duration of the third movement. And this is another kind of indication that we're moving into the middle period of Beethoven's output, because this was a trend that he wanted to explore. This was an idea. This was a form, a shift in the weight of the form that he was interested in around this time, and would be further interested in as he developed in his career, especially in the late works. You think the Opus 130 string quartet with its original Grosse Fuge as the last movement as a prime example of this. But in this case, we have a third movement full of agitation, full of storm, and full of drama, that we tend to forget that the majority of the third movement is in fact in the piano dynamic range. It's soft, and in fact it's that keeping of the soft dynamic that creates much of the drama. So if we play the first few phrases, you'll see what I mean. Only there do we arrive at our forte, right? It's that opposition between the rising figure and the motoric motion of this eighth notes and the scaling sixteenths without any dynamic change, without any crescendo. No, we rein it back until the explosions at the top. And this is true for the entire piece. This opposition between held, soft, held, quiet agitation and explosion is something that makes the drama of this movement work. And this movement, in many ways, is much more standard in terms of its structuring than the first movement, which, as we covered, the first movement is in sonata form, kind of. And this movement is very much in sonata form. However, we do have a very interesting choice of secondary key area. So as opposed to the expected E major, which is what you're supposed to do in a minor mode sonata, we have G sharp minor, which is not all that crazy, because G sharp minor is the minor dominant of our global tonic of C sharp minor. So in a major key piece, that would make sense, right? If it was C sharp major, then G sharp major for your secondary key area would be totally expected and totally fine. And here we see something also very different. In fact, we see another reason why I always say that sonata form is not about themes. It's not about the first theme, the second theme, whatever. No, it's about key areas, because in this case we have two so-called secondary themes, right? And they're both in G sharp minor. And that's the first one. And then we have a second one, which goes. And he made it very clear. He wanted to make it very clear that this is a new thing, because he removes the 16th note motor. It's a completely different texture. And then there's also a closing theme. If you weren't sure enough that we are in G sharp minor, that won't really do it. Now, the movement is incredibly explosive, like I said, but it also features an interesting device that he would go on to use in larger scale works, such as the Eroica Symphony that I mentioned before, which is the expansion of the coda. Now, the coda in this piece in this movement is relatively long, and it's relatively involved, which means that after the recapitulation, where we've maintained the ascendancy of C sharp minor, where C sharp minor in this plot narrative of a sonata form wins over its adversary, we have kind of introductions to other keys. So here's a little bit of the coda. F sharp minor, E major, question mark, and then we're back. Yes, it's not super long, but it would be a trend where he would expand this section, almost like a second developmental section to balance out. So the bigger the development got, the bigger the coda got. So that when our final resolution back to C sharp minor arrived, there was much more a sense of resolution and return. So I could go on about this sonata ad nausea for hours, but we're limited on time, so I'm going to leave that there for now. And following this, you're going to hear a little bit of the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. The second piece on tonight's program is one that is near and dear to my heart, being the first late Beethoven sonata that I heard in my life. And I think that this is true for most musicians, that the first experience that you have with late Beethoven is also the one that sticks with you the deepest and the longest. And of course, I'm speaking of Beethoven's Opus 109 Piano Sonata in E major. Now this, along with Opus 106, Opus 110, Opus 111, and maybe also you can include Opus 101, form the late sonatas as a group. And these are some of the greatest works that Beethoven wrote for the piano sonata genre. And they range so much in terms of length, in terms of expressive content, but there's a same throughput throughout all the pieces, which is that they're all incredibly masterful in their play on the sonata form that we talked about already in the Moonlight Sonata, where Beethoven at Opus 27 was already starting to experiment and push the boundaries of what was acceptable or what was possible in the sonata form. So, just like the Moonlight Sonata, Opus 109 is structured in 3 movements. And similarly, it's also structured with an attacca, meaning there is no separation between the first movement and the second movement. Now, what really stands out, amongst many things that stand out in this wonderful piece, one of the things that really stands out is the brevity of the first movement. It's incredibly short. And not only is it incredibly short, he's able to pack in such a density of material and ability, dexterousness, in how he manages the sonata form and all the things that are required of a sonata exposition. He's able to create a sonata exposition in about a minute. It's incredible. The range, if you compare that to, say, for example, something like the Hammerklavier, which is Opus 106, where the exposition is many, many, many times longer and more massive than this one. Yet they both fulfill very similar purposes, and he's able to accomplish all the harmonic and thematic goals that he wishes to in whichever piece that he is currently working on. So as you can see, the first theme, I'll play a little bit of it, is just that diminished chord already moves us into unknown territory, and there's a adagio tempo change, right? So the first theme group or key area is really only that long. He accomplishes so much in so little, and with such an economy of means. Singular rhythm, again, just like in the Moonlight, and a very simple progression. Now, this first movement, as you might have guessed, is also semi-rhapsodic, semi-fantasia-like, with many changes of tempi, and in a way takes what Moonlight did and amps it up to 11. You have much more of a feeling of improvisation with these sweeping arpeggiated sections like this. And these sudden changes and cascades of harmony. D sharp major, and this is essentially 2 or so phrases into a piece in E major. You couldn't get further away, but he accomplishes it. He accomplishes it in such short time, and with such clarity, and with such effect, that when you get back to where you should be, the clarity of that B major, it just sparkles. And the return to this material is no less magical in a development that is also is similarly short, because he's able to accomplish so much in the development. He moves keys quickly but effectively. Now, the most magical thing about this last movement, and I'm really trying to limit how much I fawn over this piece because I absolutely adore it, is the coda. Once again, this idea of the coda. And the coda in this sonata, comparatively speaking, with how long, or in this case, how short the movement is, it takes up a large portion of the entire runtime, but it's incredibly beautiful. After this descent into the very depths of the piano, and this is really the very deepest his piano can go. In fact, a few years prior, Beethoven's piano only went up to this note. So, we get down to this. Beautifully low. And then we climb out of the depths. And we hang in this glow of E major, waiting for the return of which is, of course, however, this time, instead of beginning on the tonic, we begin on the subdominant. So there is that sense that perhaps we're in a different key, perhaps. But no, it brings us back right away, and it's this angelic return. And it happens a couple times. It keeps going. The response, and then the final response, which is left hanging. And in reply is perhaps one of the most human and moving moments of the entire piece. Completely different texture, chords, doubtful, with all of these diminished sevenths, implying keys, until we finally arrive back on our dominant to E major, with which we close out. Incredibly beautiful stuff. And again, accomplished with such easy means. Just a chorale texture, some leading chords, introducing some leading tones, just to create this incredible effect of heaven and earth. Now, this first movement ends on a relatively unsettled note. Which leads so perfectly into this. In a almost black and white reverse of the Moonlight, now you have the demon between two flowers. This prestissimo second movement is stormy, it's powerful, and you might think that it has nothing in common with the first movement, and in many ways in affect, in temperament, it does not. However, in terms of its constructional materials, and this is one of the incredible things about Beethoven, he's even able to hide the footprints of his own construction to mask the paint marks, if you will. If we look back and notice what the first interval of the entire piece is, it's a third, another third, fourth. There's a lot of thirds. So the third in this movement, in the first movement, it comes up quite often as an interval of importance. And what do we get in the very beginning? More thirds, but inverted, so that we get that same inversion that mirrors the inversion of character. And the third is everywhere. The movement it's chock full of them, and it's entirely built upon this little atom of music. Now, you might say, it's such a small piece of music, and it seems so inconsequential that it can't possibly have been what he was thinking of when he composed the piece. But we do have evidence that indeed that is what he was considering. Why do I know that? Well, if we skip ahead a little bit to the third movement, what we see is double thirds this time. In both the left hand and the right hand, and this time both going up and down in contrary motion, a synthesis, if you will. Not only that, we have drafts of the piece where he had different ideas about how to write some of the variations, the last movement being a set of variations. Now, this is another marked departure. This is something that Beethoven has done before, but not to the scale that is present here. It's very large, very involved. The bulk of the piece is a set of variations in the third movement. Now, if we look at the first variation, the version that is published reads as such. And we jump down to E. Now, there was an earlier draft where this theme was written as not nearly as magical, However, what do we have in the top there? The third. So it was very clearly something that was in Beethoven's mind. We can see it through his drafting work, where he's coming back and hiding some of his tracks, making it a little less obvious what he's doing in terms of the thematic and the intervallic content that he's playing with. Now, this last movement, this set of variations on an aria with a da capo aria at the very end. We have a set of variations, and at the very end we return to the beginning. Now this is where the speculation may begin a little bit. We are not sure whether or not Beethoven himself knew the Goldberg variations, but in hearing this piece, seeing not only the da capo aria, a set of variations starting with an aria, ending with an aria, but also that this aria is curiously in the saraband rhythm. 2, 1, 2, which one can't help but think that this might be Beethoven's tribute to the great master. Now, we do know that Beethoven knew of Bach's music, and that's, again, no small feat, because if you think about it, during this period of time, of course, Mozart also had access, but that was because of Baron von Swieten, who was himself a collector of oddities. It wasn't public domain knowledge, so to speak. Bach's music had essentially died out. It was no longer performed, and it was only collected by those passionate enough to know it. We do know that while he was writing this piece, which is the same time that Beethoven was writing the Missa Solemnis, that he was influenced by Handel, that he was studying Handel's music and copying out certain sections of Handel's music in his notebooks. That we do know. However, in terms of his relationship with Bach, this is mere speculation, simply based on the character of the music, and it's kind of unique and odd structuring, where we have that da capo aria. But more so than that, this last movement features a lot of contrapuntal tools. It's incredibly contrapuntal. So you see, if we have variation 3, we have, which is an example of invertible counterpoint. The first phrase, it's the same music, except that the first time the right hand has the rising part, and the second time the left hand has the rising part. And then we have the next variation, which is a canon. And the next variation, which is a fugato. And then we look at the very last variation before the return to the theme. We see Beethoven employing a tactic that Bach used in his own variational structures, which is not changing tempi, but affecting the effect, creating the effect of a tempo change by adding notes, by creating more density. And we see this really elegantly. We start with quarter notes, just like the theme, which then doubles to eighths, which then we go to triplets. Well, it's 9/8, but essentially triplets, and then triplet sixteenths, and then 30 seconds. And then when 30 seconds, he didn't want to write 64ths. So, trills. So it's essentially this increasingly dense texture, this increasingly active, this increase in the moment-to-moment movement without an actual increase of pace, and which is something that Bach himself, especially in the Goldberg variations, accomplished incredibly beautifully. And then we have, of course, at the very end, the da capo aria. the effect of this piece that is so unified and yet gives us so many different sounds and so many different ways of hearing essentially one interval, the interval of the third, is that it creates a remarkable unity. I think amongst all his sonatas, this one, it almost feels like if you were to play it or conceive it in one breath. It's a whirlwind from the beginning of the very first note of the first movement all the way to the end, to that return of the capo aria. And there's something incredibly exhilarating about that. So if you want to hear the entire piece, be sure to tune in.
Thank you so much, Larry. So when programming this concert, you can't celebrate Beethoven without including some representative of his chamber music. What makes Beethoven so incredible and also so difficult to perform is that every note mattered. Every note was the most important note. There were no throwaway pieces or throwaway movements or whatever. You can see this in the writing. If you were to look at the manuscripts of Beethoven's music, compared to something like Mozart, Mozart's manuscripts are completely clean, spotless, like they were just taken down by dictation. But if you look at the manuscript of Beethoven's music, it is a complete mess. There's scribbles and scratch outs and changes and notes about this or that, or like shopping lists. I mean, it was a person who felt the weight of every single note. You can also see this in the sheer numbers comparisons. So if you look at someone like Haydn, who wrote 68 string quartets, compared to Beethoven, who only wrote 16, or Beethoven, who wrote 9 symphonies, whereas Mozart wrote around 50. And I think it is extremely evident, especially in his chamber music. He creates this incredible world where musicians can truly communicate and have dialogues through their instruments. When performing the chamber music of Beethoven, you really get that quality. And it was surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, hard to do when your collaborator isn't in the room. And so for my little portion of the convocation, I thought I would kind of give you an insight into my experience as to what it was like to put together this sonata, being literally thousands of miles away from the pianist. And so when Larry and I were discussing how are we going to make this happen, how are we going to put this sonata together without being in the same room, and we decided that what would happen is Larry would record the piano part first, and then he would send it to me, and then I would record myself on top of him. And in theory, that made sense. But then when in practice, when I got the video, and I started to try to play along with it, I started to realize how inhibiting it is. And it's sort of ironic because we're playing the music of a composer who famously couldn't hear later in life. And here I am playing essentially with a pianist who can't hear me. So it was kind of a moment of surprise, because I realized now that I really had to sort of do everything to serve whatever Larry's interpretation was in that moment. And then on top of the fact that Larry can't hear me as we're playing together, I'm also playing with headphones. And so I'm also slightly at a disadvantage where I can't really hear myself absolutely either. So it's this really weird situation that we're all sort of dealing with right now. And I thought I would sort of give you a behind the scenes look of what it's like, because I know a lot of you are going to have to deal with that as well when you're planning out your recitals that could potentially happen this semester, where you may have to create music with people who aren't in the room. So here's a clip from the second movement of the Beethoven Spring Sonata. And here is a segment where Larry is supposedly accompanying me. So that's basically what I received. And if anything, I think this is an incredible testament to the power of the accompaniment voice. But before we discuss it, here is the final product where I play on top of what Larry provided me. So as you can see, I think it actually turned out really well. It's coherent, it has motion, it has emotion, and I think that one of the real misconceptions when it comes to the accompaniment figure is we feel that there's this inherent submissive nature of the accompaniment line. We think that the solo line or the main theme, the melody line, is the primary, and the accompaniment must serve the will and the need of the melodic line. And so you might be inclined to play that accompaniment figure passively. But the real lesson here is that in many ways, the accompaniment line is actually even more important than the melody. The accompaniment line has the power to completely manipulate the melodic line, both in tempo and in dynamic and in drive. Everything can be created through the force of the accompaniment line. And so this is something that I think you should all take into consideration, not just in Beethoven, but in any environment where you're playing the line that isn't necessarily the one that everyone's paying attention to, and try to find a way not to feel resentment that you're not in the spotlight or that you don't get to play the melody, but see how much room there is to create an incredible interpretation through the accompaniment. So I thought that it would just be an interesting insight for you to see what it's like in today's world, in today's post-COVID world, where so much of our creation is happening virtually and digitally on software. And I guess my little piece of advice in conclusion is to not shy away from it. Don't assume a position of rigidity. It's a really cool and exciting time to explore your various talents. So I sincerely hope that you'll all join us tonight for the Dalton Live and Interactive series. It's online. I'd like to also thank Western Michigan University for continuing to put these events together, whether it's in person or online. I think it's very meaningful both for you as students to see that life goes on and that there's no excuse for not continuing your education, your development, and that we shouldn't just sit around and wait for the ideal sort of environment to thrive, that we need to persevere and continue to not just make the best of it, but be the best that we can be regardless. So thank you again for your attendance today, and I hope to see you all very soon in person. So have a great afternoon, and hopefully see you tonight at the concert.